BBC Radio 4 is a radio station owned and operated by the British Broadcasting Corporation that broadcasts a wide variety of spoken word programmes, including news, drama, comedy, science and history. It replaced the BBC Home Service in 1967. The station controller is Gwyneth Williams, and the station is a part of BBC Radio and the BBC Radio Department. The station is broadcast from the BBC's headquarters at Broadcasting House, London. It is the second most popular domestic radio station in the UK, broadcast throughout the UK, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands on FM, LW and DAB, and can be received in the north of France and Northern Europe. It is also available through Freeview, Sky, Virgin Media and on the Internet. Its sister station, BBC Radio 4 Extra, complements the main channel by broadcasting repeats from the Radio 4 archive, extended versions of Radio 4 programs and supplements to series such as The Archers and Desert Island Discs. It is notable for its news bulletins and programs such as Today in the World at 1, heralded on air by the Greenwich time signal, Pips, or the chimes of Big Ben. Outline. BBC Radio 4 is the second most popular British domestic radio station by total hours, after Radio 2, and the most popular in London and the south of England. It recorded its highest audience, of 11 million listeners, in May 2011 and was UK Radio Station of the Year at the 2003, 2004 and 2008 Sony Radio Academy Awards. It also won a Peabody Award in 2002 for File on 4 export controls. Costing £71.4 million, it is the BBC's most expensive national radio network and is considered by many to be its flagship. There is no comparable British commercial network. Channel 4 abandoned plans to launch its own speech-based digital radio station in October 2008 as a part of the £100 million cost-cutting review. In 2010, Gwyneth Williams replaced Mark Damazer as Radio 4 controller. Damazer became Master of St Peter's College, Oxford. Music and sport are the only fields that largely fall outside the station's remit. It broadcasts occasional concerts and documentaries related to various forms of both popular and classical music, and the long-running music-based Desert Island Discs. Prior to the creation of BBC Radio 5, it broadcasts sports-based features, notably Sport on 4, and since the creation of BBC Radio 5 Live has become the home of ball-by-ball commentaries of most Test cricket matches played by England, broadcast on long wave. As a result, for around 70 days a year, listeners have to rely on FM broadcasts or increasingly DAB for mainstream Radio 4 broadcasts. The number relying solely on long wave is now a small minority. The cricket broadcasts take precedence over on-the-hour news bulletins, but not the shipping forecast, carried since its move to long wave in 1978, because that can be received clearly at sea. The station is the UK's national broadcaster in times of national emergency, such as war, due to the wide coverage of the Droitwich signal. If all other radio stations were forced to close, it would carry on broadcasting. It has been claimed that the commanders of nuclear-armed submarines, believing that Britain had suffered nuclear attack, were required to check if they could still receive Radio 4 on 198 long wave, and if they could not, they would open sealed orders that might authorize a retaliatory strike. As well as news and drama, the station has a strong reputation for comedy, including experimental and alternative comedy. Many successful comedians and comedy shows first appearing on the station. The station is available on FM in most of Great Britain, parts of Ireland and the north of France, LW throughout the UK and in parts of Northern Europe, and the Atlantic north of the Azores to about 20 degrees west, MW in some areas, DAB, digital TV including Freeview, Freesat, Sky and Virgin Media, and on the Internet. History. The BBC Home Service was the predecessor of Radio 4 and broadcast between 1939 and 1967. It had regional variations and was broadcast on medium wave, with a network of VHF-FM transmitters being added from 1955. Radio 4 replaced it on 30 September 1967, when the BBC renamed many of its domestic radio stations, in response to the challenge of offshore radio. It moved to long wave in November 1978, taking over the 200 kHz frequency previously held by Radio 2, and later moved to 198 kHz as a result of international agreements aimed at avoiding interference. For a time during the 1970s, Radio 4 carried regional news bulletins Monday to Saturday. These were broadcast twice at breakfast, lunchtime, and an evening bulletin at 5:55 p.m., plus programme variations for parts of England not served by BBC local radio stations. These included Roundabout East Anglia, a VHF opt-out of the Today programme broadcast from BBC studios in Norwich each weekday from 6:45 a.m. to 8:45 a.m. Roundabout East Anglia came to an end in 1980, when local radio services were introduced to East Anglia with the launch of BBC Radio Norfolk. All regional news bulletins broadcast from BBC regional news bases around England ended in August 1980. The South West was the only exception, having no BBC local radio. These news bulletins and its weekday morning regional programme Morning Sue Western output of Today continued to be broadcast from the BBC studios in Plymouth on VHF and the Radio 4 relay on medium wave, until the 31st of December 1982, and just before the launch of BBC Radio Cornwall and BBC Radio Devon. The launch of Radio 5 on 27 August 1990 saw the removal of Open University Schools programming and their Study on 4 adult education slot to the news station, resulting in the full Radio 4 schedule being available on FM for the first time. Between the 17th of January 1991 and the 2nd of March 1991, FM broadcasts were replaced by a continuous news service devoted to the Gulf War, Radio 4 News FM, with the main Radio 4 service being exclusively on long wave. In September 1991, it was decided that the main Radio 4 service would be on FM, as coverage had extended to cover almost all of the UK. Opt-outs were transferred to long wave. Currently Test Match Special, Extra Shipping Forecasts, The Daily Service and Today in Parliament. Long wave very occasionally opts out at other times, such as to broadcast special services, the most recent being where the Pope visited Britain in 2010. The long wave signal is part of the Royal Navy's system of last resort letters. In the event of a suspected catastrophic attack on Britain, submarine commanders, in addition to other checks, check for a broadcast signal from Radio 4 on 198 long wave to verify the annihilation of organised society in Great Britain. Programmes and schedules. Daily schedule. The simulcast from the BBC World Service begins at 100 and ends at 5:20 with a brief introduction from the early shift continuity announcer. The 5-minute Radio 4 UK theme, composed by Fritz Spiegel, followed this for 28 years until April 2006. It was replaced by an extension to the early news bulletin, despite public opposition and a campaign to save it. After a continuity link in Programme Trail, there are a shipping forecast, weather reports from coastal stations for 400 GMT and the inshore waters forecasts, followed at 5:30 by a news bulletin, a review of British and international newspapers, and a business report. On weekdays at 5:45, Farming Today, which deals with news of relevance to the agricultural sector, is followed by Tweet of the Day, a 2-minute feature looking at different species of birds through their songs and calls. The morning news and current affairs sequence Today then runs for 3 hours from 600 to 900 on weekdays. The remainder of the day's schedule is determined by the day of the week, with the following fixtures on weekdays: Book of the Week at 9:45, Woman's Hour at 10:02, You and Yours at 12:15, The World at 1, and a repeat of the previous days, The Archers at 14:02. The afternoon drama at 14:15. At 1700 another current affairs program, PM, is broadcast. At 18:30 there is a regular comedy slot, The Archers at 19:02, Front Row at 19:15, and a repeat of the 15-minute drama at 19:45. The World Tonight airs at 2200, followed by Book It Bedtime at 22:45. At weekends the schedule is different, with other fixed features at various times. News is broadcast at the top of each hour. A 2-minute summary, a longer bulletin as part of a current affairs program, or a 30-minute program on weekdays at 1800 and midnight. At 1200, FM carries a 4-minute bulletin, while longwave has the headlines followed by a shipping forecast. On weekdays, longwave also leaves PM for a 3-minute shipping forecast at 17:54. There is a news program or bulletin at 2200. A report on the day's proceedings in the Westminster Parliament is broadcast at 23:30 and repeated, on LW only, at 8:31 the following morning. The midnight news is followed on weekdays by a repeat of Book of the Week. The tune Sailing By is played until 0:48, when the late shipping forecast is broadcast. As the timing of the forecast is critical, the Sailing By theme must be started at a set time and faded in as the last program ends. Radio 4 finishes with God Save the Queen, and the World Service takes over from 100 until 5:20. Timing is sacrosanct on the channel, running over the hour except in special circumstances or the occasional scheduled instance is unheard of, and interrupting the Greenwich time signal on the hour is frowned upon. An online schedule page lists the running order of programs. Production: many programs are pre-recorded. Programs transmitted live include Today magazine program Woman's Hour, consumer affairs program You and Yours, and the music, film, books, arts and culture program Front Row. Continuity is managed from Broadcasting House with news bulletins, including the hourly summaries, and longer programs such as the 6 o'clock news and midnight news, and news programs such as Today, The World at 1 and PM, which by early 2013 had returned to Broadcasting House after 15 years at BBC Television Centre in White City. The news returning to Broadcasting House has also meant that newsreaders can provide cover for continuity, which regularly occurs at 2300 each night and 1600 on a Sunday. This has reduced the total number of continuity announcers required each day down from 4 to 3. The time signal, known as the pips, is broadcast every hour to herald the news bulletin, except at midnight and 1800, where the chimes of Big Ben are played. Programs: Radio 4 programs cover a wide variety of genre including news and current affairs, history, culture, science, religion, arts, drama and light entertainment. A number of the programs on Radio 4 take the form of a magazine show, featuring numerous small contributions over the course of the program. Woman's Hour, from our own correspondent, You and Yours. The rise of these magazine shows is primarily due to the work of Tony Whitby, controller of Radio 4 from 1970 to 1975. The station hosts a number of long-running programs, many of which have been broadcast for over 40 years. Most programs are available for a week after broadcast, his streaming audio from Radio 4's Listen Again page and via BBC iPlayer. A selection of programs is also available as podcasts or downloadable audio files. Many comedy and drama programs from the Radio 4 archives are rebroadcast on BBC Radio 4 Extra. Due to the capacity limitations of DAB and increasing sport broadcasts on BBC 5 Live Sports Extra, BBC Radio 4 DAB has to reduce its bitrate most evenings, such that after 7 p.m. its DAB output is usually in mono. Even though many of its programs are made in stereo, these can only be heard in stereo on FM, digital TV on Freeview and Freesat, Sky, Virgin and online via BBC iPlayer Radio. BBC World Service, which uses BBC Radio 4 FM and DAB frequencies between 1 AM and 5:20 AM, is in stereo, but only on Radio 4 FM and DAB and not on its own dedicated DAB channel. BBC Radio 4 Extra broadcasts in mono on DAB, but has always been in stereo on digital TV, Sky, Virgin and online. Notable continuity announcers and newsreaders. Announcers link programs and read trails for programs and the shipping forecast. Newsreaders read hourly summaries and longer bulletins. Main newsreaders, continuity announcers. In 2012, the BBC announced that it would be reducing its main presentation team from 12 to 10. The following are primarily newsreaders but also contribute to much of the continuity output. Newsreaders, continuity announcers: Jim Lee, David Miles, Alan Smith. Continuity announcers: Neil Nunes. Former staff: Alice Arnold, Carolyn Brown, Harriet Cass, Peter Donaldson, Marion Foster, now presenting Garden Mania on BBC Newcastle, Charlotte Green, Peter Jefferson, Astley Jones, Laurie Macmillan, Rory Morrison, Jamie Owen, Brian Perkins, Ian Purden, Moira Stewart. Frequencies and other means of reception. Radio 4 is broadcast on 92 to 95 MHz FM in England, and from some transmitters in Wales 94.6-96.1 and 103.5-104.9 MHz in Scotland, 93.2-96.0 and 103.5-104.6 MHz in Northern Ireland, 103.0-104.5 MHz from other transmitters in Wales. 198 kHz long wave, medium wave in some areas, 603 kHz in Newcastle upon Tyne, 720 kHz in London, Derry and Belfast, 756 kHz in Redruth, 774 kHz in Plymouth and Enniskillen, 1449 kHz in Aberdeen, 1485 kHz in Carlisle. DAB standard FM content subsidiary LW content, where applicable. Freeview channel 704. The Internet iPlayer live streaming. Digital satellite. Radio 4 FM. Freesat channel 704. Sky channel 0104. Radio 4 LW. Freesat channel 710. Sky channel 0143. Virgin Media channel 904, channel 911. Selected other cable television providers: Virgin Media Ireland channel 910 in Republic of Ireland. Talk TV channel 604. Criticisms. There have been criticisms voiced by newspapers in recent years over a perceived left-wing bias across a range of issues such as the EU and the Iraq War, as well as sycophancy in interviews, particularly on the popular morning news magazine Today, as a part of a reported perception of a general malaise at the BBC. Conversely, the journalist Mehdi Hassan has criticized the station for an overtly, socially and culturally conservative approach. There has been frequent criticism of Radio 4, and Today in particular, for a lack of female broadcasters. In September 1972, Radio 4 employed the first female continuity announcers, Hilda Bamber and Barbara Edwards. For quite some time, the introduction of female newsreaders led to complaints from listeners. Women discussing topics of feminist interest led to similar complaints. This led the satirical magazine Private Eye to lampoon Women's Hour as Women's Whinge, and the network as FEM. Radio 4 has also been frequently criticized for being too middle-class and being of little interest to non-white listeners.